So, as usual, Stan, your questions could take me, 5 hours to answer. So I'm going to selectively pick certain pieces of it.
Sure.
Because for many of your viewers, this may be the first time in their life they've heard the word tontine. They don't know how to spell it yet, and maybe they're Googling it right now. So there's a lot going on. So let me explain a little bit of historical background, and hopefully this partially answers the many questions you've just asked. What interests me, why I'm fascinated with history, is because the narrative right now in the financial industry is that pensions are going away. Pensions are going away. Defined benefit pensions are no longer the norm for employees. Social Security, the trust fund in the U.S., is on its way down. So there's questions about sustainability, and employers don't really care about their employees once they retire. So you're on your own, buddy. Ergo, we must all move into the annuity space. What interests me is what in the world did people do prior to defined benefit pensions? Not what are they going to do in the demise and decline of defined benefit. What did they do before? And, if you take a look at when defined benefit pensions started, we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, Social Security, FDR, the 1930s. If you're really familiar with pension history, then you'll know the name Bismarck, the German chancellor. He starts pensions in 1880, and everybody's entitled when they get old to get a pension. What did old people do before these state programs? Now, the ignorant response is that there were no old people prior to 1880, and that Bismarck somehow discovered that there's old people and we need to give them pensions. That is simply not true. Life expectancy at birth might have been very low. There were many old people. In fact, if you go back to the archives, there are people that made it into their 80s and 90s, and I could spend an entire hour going through all the famous philosophers and statesmen and U.S. presidents from the Revolution onward that lived far beyond life expectancy. What did they do? How did they get to retirement, stop being able to work, and how did they get an income? And the next response tends to be, well, their family supported them. They lived at home and they didn't need it. That's also not true because of the fact that not all of them had families, and many of the families had moved away. So once you sort of eliminate all the nonsense, you're left with how did they finance their retirement? And the answer is they went out and they bought annuities. They went to the state, they went to the government, they went to early insurance companies, they went to their local church, they went to their parish, and they entered into a scheme where they would be receiving an income for the rest of their life, guaranteed, a word that you like, as long as they live, in exchange for a lump sum right now. In fact, the earliest nursing homes were monasteries where people would go in. They were called karodis, where you go into the monastery and say, look, I got a bunch of money. This is my nest egg. You take it. Take care of me for the rest of my life. And they would, in a sense, issue an annuity. And the annuity would be paid not just in living somewhere. They'd be paid in beer and bread and wine and, a shirt once a year. And that would be your annuity. It would be paid in goods and services. Part of the products that people bought hundreds of years ago to maintain themselves in retirement was a word that you just mentioned, called a tontine. A tontine was one of the many schemes that people used to finance themselves in retirement. It was a scheme in which the longest living people got the most amount of income. The people that didn't live a long time got a smaller amount of income. It was a type of an annuity. And I think that, with that background, we understand that there are many different ways to finance retirement in the Middle Ages, and that was one of them. And I find the tontine an interesting scheme, and I think that there's more discussion about bringing it back. That's sort of the 3-minute summary.
Hey, Stan the Annuity Man here. Did you like that little taste of my podcast, Fun with Annuities? Hey, if you want to see the full version, click the link and watch the whole darn thing. Remember, Fun with Annuities. Live in the reality, not the dream.